Welcome to my new video series. In this series, we will explore the hidden and unseen forces which shape how we think. Very often, we do things only because we have been doing them that way for a long time. We can't imagine doing it any other way. But why did we start doing it that way to begin with? Well, let me give you an example of what I mean. In 2015, National Geographic ran an experiment where a group of people in a waiting room stood up every time they heard a beep. A test subject, who was an outsider with no knowledge of what was going on, came in. With no explanation, she slowly began to conform. One by one, the people in the experiment left the room, until only the lady was left, but she still kept standing up every time she heard the beep. The power of conformity, right? But that's not all. The really crazy part is the next part of the video. New test subjects came in, and they began to conform to what the social expectation was too. Remember, they are all total strangers. They don't know each other. They have no reason to stand up. But they are doing it because that's how things are done. That's the power of conformity and tradition. We unconsciously keep doing things because they have always been done that way. We don't stop to question why. And that's what this show is about, shedding light on the hidden and unseen forces which shape how we think and act today. Singaporeans will soon go to the polls to vote for our next president. Why does this matter? Singapore's president can't actually do much. After Ong Teng Cheong's term, the powers of the presidency were reduced, and the Council of Presidential Advisors in many important areas can overrule her. That's right, I said her. #feminism, #foregone conclusion. As Chan Chun Sing inadvertently revealed all the way back in February this year,
Madam President, I think today is not the occasion for us to go through this again. Madam President, if I was about to, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, sorry, my bad.
But last year, the Constitution was altered, again, to change how the presidency would work. The biggest change which we are talking about here today is that it would henceforth rotate between races.
We've decided to do this through what the Constitutional Commission has called the hiatus-triggered model, which means that presidential elections are generally open to candidates of all races. But if we've not had a president from a particular community for 5 consecutive terms, then the next term will be reserved for candidates from that community. This means that over 6 election terms, we should expect to see at least 1 Chinese president, 1 Malay president, 1 president who is either an Indian or another minority.
Can you imagine applying this to other areas? For example, we want to win the Olympics, but because we haven't sent a Malay swimmer for the past 5 Olympics, so we can't send Joseph Schooling again. We have to send a Malay swimmer. It makes no sense. You want to pick the best person for the job. The presidency may have very few powers, but it is still the highest office in Singapore. It should not be treated like a toy that you need to share equally between your children. The PAP government argued that the changes are needed to make sure all races are represented. That's good. Representation is important in combating racism. But there is a fundamental flaw at the heart of this. It's the CMIO system. Chinese, Malay, Indian, others. As long as we use the CMIO system, these changes will lead to more racism, not less. You see, before the British came along, we did not have a concept of race. Race theory was invented by the Europeans in the 1700s and was a foreign concept introduced to Singapore by the British. The British ran Singapore as a business for profit. That is where our CMIO race model comes from. It's a cheap way of running a country. The British put us into boxes that were convenient for them. Which box you wanted to be in did not matter. All that matters is that once you are shoved into a box, the government can just treat every single person in that box the same way. So instead of having to govern hundreds of thousands of individual people, they just had to govern 4 boxes. Cheap, easy. But then people ask, why is that box being treated better than my box? And then they try and get into that box. And the people in the better box fight to keep other people out of their box. People get angry. Tensions grow. And this suited the British. They could play the boxes against each other, divide and rule. This ensured that the boxes would get angry at each other, not at the British. You might say they were boxing. The ultimate expression of this is, of course, Malaya. The British took one country, Malaya, which was evenly divided, 43% Malay, 43% Chinese, and split it into 2 parts. One part Malay-dominated and the other Chinese-dominated, to play us against each other. And it worked. Look at our countries today. We are 2 halves of a single body, but insist that we are totally different from each other. We're not alone in this. Everywhere the British went, they left behind deeply divided countries. It's one of the 3 great legacies of British colonialism. Cricket, driving on the left, and massive racial antipathy that fuels an endless cycle of mutual suspicion, fear, and conflict. If you or your father came from China or British India, the British classified you as Chinese or Indian. 1 territory, 1 category. Okay, that's easy, straightforward. But how did the British define Malay to refer to people from all the different countries in maritime Southeast Asia and the Middle East? Well, and this is totally true, in the 1921 census, the British admitted that they simply couldn't tell them apart. That's the basis of our category of Malay. A bunch of white colonialists looked at all the Muslim brown people and said, we can't tell all you brown people apart, so let's call all of you the same thing. Jolly good. And yet, we still use the term today the exact same way. Now, for a while after independence, we tried to move away from all of this. We had a vision of a meritocratic Singapore where all people had an equal chance to succeed based on hard work. But since the 1980s, when the GRCs were introduced, we have been going back to the colonial model. With this presidential election, it is clear that the PAP government has stopped aspiring to one united people regardless of race. Today, your political rights actually differ depending on your race. We are not equal. And the whole situation is further complicated by the fact that your race on your IC and your CMIO race are 2 different things. This is true. This was confirmed in a Facebook post by PAP MP Zainal bin Sapari in July. Instead, how your race is decided for CMIO purposes follows a 2-step process. At a town hall meeting last year, Minister K. Shanmugam explained it this way. First, what do you consider yourself as? Do you consider yourself Malay? Do you consider yourself Chinese? If you are Chinese, you cannot be Malay. Apparently, he's never heard of the Peranakans. Second, you then go to a committee which decides whether you are what you say you are. So even if you believe you are Malay, even if your IC says that you are Malay, this committee could actually tell you that, no, you are not Malay, and vice versa. Mr. Shanmugam says that they need to decide on your race for you to prevent people from gaming the system. But people try to game the system because they feel the other boxes are being treated better than their own box. And the people in the better box fight to keep other people out of their box. In our system, so much depends on your CMIO race. Where you can live, where your children go to school, what kind of assistance you can get from the government. And now, even your political rights as a citizen. But you do not get to decide your own identity for yourself. The fact that the government is worried about people gaming the system is because of the unequal treatment of races and is itself proof that the CMIO system breeds conflict. And if this is not enough to convince you that CMIO is a historically flawed system, well, You may have noticed the furious debates over whether the presidential candidates are Malay enough. These are destructive debates. They divide us against each other. But guess what? The exact same debates happened nearly 100 years ago in the 1920s. Remember how I told you that the British ended up classifying all brown-skinned Muslims as Malay? That led to the Malay community fighting over who should speak for the community. There were far more Southeast Asian Malays, but the Arab Muslims were much richer and so had much more influence. This led to furious debates over who was Malay enough. Insults were thrown. People got hurt. The first Malay political party was founded in order to fight for indigenous Malay rights. 100 years later, and we are having the same debate for the same reason. The CMIO system not only turns us against each other, it's been doing so for at least 100 years. Over the past 100 years, we have plenty of examples from around the world of how politicizing race takes us in a dangerous direction. Certificates for race? Giving people arbitrary power to determine your race? Giving people political power based upon their ability to prove to a committee that they are of a certain race? These have all been done, and they have all ended the same way. Now don't get me wrong, we have serious problems of discrimination in Singapore. But the history of Singapore, and many other British colonies, shows how the CMIO model is the cause of many of the problems, not the solution. It does nothing to stop people who refuse to rent to minority races. It does nothing to stop those advertisements in the classifieds which say bilingual speakers only when they actually mean Chinese people only. It does nothing to stop casual racism and offensive stereotypes. All these things happen every day in Singapore. If we want to build one united people, regardless of race, then we must take race out of politics. I believe all Singaporeans should be equal and anybody should be allowed to run for president. I believe that Singaporeans are smart enough to vote for the best candidate for president, and we don't need some committee telling us who can and cannot run. I believe that all Singaporeans deserve equality, dignity, and respect. Instead of blindly clinging to a system which has been used to divide and rule, we need to change. So why don't we? I believe our politicians are good and well-intentioned people, so why do they insist on clinging to a system which breeds racial strife? Sometimes we do things because that's how we've always done them. Because we can't possibly imagine doing it any other way. But if we don't analyze the powerful social, cultural, and historical forces which shape how we think and how we see the world, we're going to end up standing up and sitting down to the sound of a bell without ever understanding why. That's what this show is about. In future episodes, I hope to talk about topics like religion, education, the economy, poverty and inequality, and unpack the forces which have shaped them. If you've enjoyed this show and would like to see more, I need your support. Help us create more episodes by joining New Narrative. Join our movement. You can learn more at this video here or by visiting our website here. That's our show. Thank you very much and see you next time.